They said, just find her something modest, the cheapest place that still takes Medicare. They said it in my kitchen, at my table, beside the tulips I planted myself, in the house I built from the money I earned teaching other people's children how to read and think. My own son, my own daughter-in-law, sitting there with spreadsheets and brochures for nursing homes as if they were choosing a vacation package, discussing my body, my mind, my remaining usefulness, like I was already halfway gone. I remember the way the light came through the blinds that morning, thin and gray, slicing the room into perfect rectangles. I kept staring at those rectangles because if I looked at their faces, I might have said something unforgivable. It was Daniel who spoke first, calm, careful, managerial in tone. "Mom, we just want you to be comfortable." Comfortable. Such a gentle word for exile. Carla nodded, her hair pulled back, her tablet open to a website called Golden Pines Assisted Living, with smiling gray-haired people playing bingo in matching sweaters. She turned the screen toward me and said, "See? It's lovely. There's even a courtyard with roses. You love roses, don't you?" "I do," I thought, "but not behind locked doors. Not roses I can't plant myself." I didn't answer them right away. At 81, you learn the power of silence. It scares the young. It makes them talk more than they mean to. They took my silence as agreement, of course. Daniel kept explaining how the house had become too much responsibility and how the market was in our favor right now. He used words like asset and liquidity, as if my walls and floors were numbers, not memories. He said they'd handle everything, the listing, the legal paperwork, the transition plan. I should only think about rest. It's strange, the moment you realize people you love have already buried you in their plans. I looked at the tulips on the table, pale orange, slightly wilted, and wondered if they would remember to water them after I was gone. I live by the sea, in a town where gulls wake you before sunrise, and the air always smells faintly of salt and iron. The house isn't grand, but it breathes with me. I know every sound it makes, the way the stair sighs under my left foot, the kettle's uneven whistle, the window that chatters when the wind changes direction. I bought it 42 years ago, after my husband died. Back then, people said I was brave. Now they call it stubbornness. The truth is simpler. It's mine. Mine in a world that keeps shrinking women like me into afterthoughts. When they finished their presentation, because that's what it was, a presentation, I poured more coffee. My hands didn't shake. I asked Daniel whether the new place would have room for my piano. He blinked, confused. "What piano?" "The one you learned scales on, remember?" He looked to Carla, and she said, "Oh, I don't think they allow personal instruments, but there's a communal recreation room. You can share." Share. Another gentle knife. I smiled and said, "I'll think about it." He exhaled, relieved, already imagining the sale sign on the lawn. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house felt too still, like it was waiting for me to decide its fate. I walked from room to room, touching the things they wanted to erase. The framed photo of my first class of students in 1968, the chipped teacup my mother brought from Naples, the quilt I sewed the year Daniel was born. I ran my fingers along the piano keys. Dust made them dull, but when I pressed one, the note rang clear, almost defiant. I thought of all the times Daniel sat beside me, legs too short to reach the pedals, and how he'd giggle when I let him press the high notes. I wondered what happened to that boy, the one who once cried because he thought the Easter Bunny looked lonely. Somewhere along the way, he learned to speak a different language, the language of profit and optimization. I suppose I taught him too well to plan, but never to feel. I made tea and sat by the window until the horizon began to pale. The sea was calm, a thin silver line at the edge of everything. I thought about how easily families rewrite love into logistics, how kindness turns into management. When my own mother grew frail, we didn't have much money, but we kept her at home. I slept on a cot beside her bed for 3 years. She died holding my hand. No one talked about placement or long-term care solutions. We simply called it life. I realize times have changed, costs have risen, but humanity shouldn't be a budget item. Around 6, I heard Daniel's car start in the driveway. He left early for work, as always. Carla lingered upstairs. I could hear her heels crossing the bedroom floor. When she came down, she smiled the thin smile of someone practicing sincerity. "Don't take what we said last night the wrong way," she began, buttering toast. "We just want to do what's best for everyone." I said, "Of course," and stirred my tea. Then she added, "It's just, this house is big, and it's not fair to expect Daniel to keep up with all the maintenance once you move." Once I move, not if, once. The decision already made, my existence already shifted into a past tense. She kissed the air near my cheek, grabbed her keys, and left a trail of perfume that smelled like victory. I went out to the garden. The morning light was sharp, almost metallic. The tulips had opened fully, shameless in their color. I bent down to pull a weed and felt the steady ache in my back, that old familiar whisper of time. But pain no longer frightens me. What frightens me is the ease with which people talk about erasing an entire life's labor under the pretext of convenience. The house creaked behind me, as if listening. I said aloud, "They think I'm done." A gull screamed above, its cry torn and wild, and I thought, maybe that's what defiance sounds like when you've run out of audience. After breakfast, I took out the old metal box where I keep my papers, the deeds, the savings bonds, the letters my husband wrote during his last hospital stay. I spread them on the dining table, the same table where they'd planned my removal. There, in neat black ink, was my name on the property title, still unaltered. I whispered it to myself, testing its weight. Eleanor Margaret Ross. It felt solid, like something unbreakable. I realized then that the real tragedy wasn't their greed, it was their certainty that I wouldn't resist. They mistook my quiet for surrender. They forgot who taught them patience, who taught them the difference between politeness and weakness. By the time the clock struck 10, I'd showered, dressed, and brushed my hair back into the style I wore in my 40s. Simple, no nonsense, the way I looked when I signed the papers for this house. I walked through every room again, not in mourning but in inventory, counting what still belonged to me, the memories, the will, the proof of self. And as I walked, something unexpected began to rise, not anger, not fear, but a strange, calm amusement. Let them think they're moving a pawn. I've been a queen all along, just quiet about it. When Carla returned in the afternoon, she found me in the living room polishing the piano. She commented on how energetic I looked. "Maybe you're right," I said pleasantly. "Maybe a change would do me good." Her relief was visible. She called Daniel that evening, thinking I didn't hear. "She's finally on board," she whispered. I smiled to myself and played a few notes, soft but sure, like the beginning of a song no one else could hear. That was the day I stopped waiting for their permission, the day I understood that sometimes the only way to keep what's yours is to let them think they've taken it. The sea outside turned pink with dusk, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel old. I felt unfinished. And I promised myself that the next time they spoke of me as a burden, I would show them what a burden looks like when it stands up and walks away. I found out the truth not through confession or accident, but through paperwork, the way most betrayals reveal themselves in old age, not by raised voices, but by fine print. It was a Thursday, the kind of day that pretends to be harmless, gray and slow, smelling faintly of rain. I had gone to the post office to send a birthday card to a friend when I noticed a letter addressed to me in a neat, unfamiliar script. Inside was a notification from the county assessor's office thanking me for the recent transfer inquiry regarding property reassessment. I read it twice before I understood. They had already begun the process of moving my house out of my name. My son and daughter-in-law, those polite conspirators with their smiles and their lattes, had contacted the bank, pretending I had consented to sell. The words on the page trembled, even though my hands didn't. I folded the letter, put it back into the envelope, and walked home slowly, counting my breaths like someone crossing a narrow bridge. When I reached the house, Carla's car was gone, and the silence inside felt heavier than usual. I set the envelope on the kitchen table and sat down beside it, staring at the grain of the wood. The table had a faint burn mark near the edge from when Daniel was 12 and decided to teach himself to make pancakes. I'd told him then that mistakes could be mended if you took responsibility. I wonder what became of that lesson. I stared at the mark until my eyes blurred, and when the tears came, they weren't the loud, sobbing kind. They were small, silent rebellions escaping through the cracks of control. I let them fall onto the envelope like sealing wax. When I was done, I wiped my face with the hem of my sleeve and poured myself a glass of water. I realized I hadn't cried for years, not even when my sister died. The tears surprised me with their heat, as if I had been storing them like savings for a day when I might need proof that I was still capable of feeling. By the time Daniel came home that evening, I was composed again. He found me folding laundry in the living room. He looked tired but satisfied, the expression of a man who believes he has done the right thing for everyone. I asked him how his day went. He said fine. I handed him a towel, freshly folded, and said quietly, "I got a letter today from the assessor's office." His shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Oh?" he said, pretending confusion. "Yes," I said, "about the reassessment of this property. Apparently, there's been some inquiry from your end." There was a pause, long enough for me to hear the tick of the clock on the mantel. "We're just exploring options, Mom. You know, in case you decide to move, it's routine." "Routine," he said, like betrayal had an administrative process. I wanted to ask him why he didn't trust me to be part of my own decisions, why the child I'd carried in my arms now carried out plans against me as if I were a burden to be managed. But the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I asked, "And did you also find a place for me?" He hesitated. "Carla's been looking at some facilities. She found one that's really quite lovely, Mom. They have yoga classes for seniors and therapy dogs and a garden you can visit." Visit. Not plant, not own. Visit. As if life were now a museum I'd been granted weekend access to. I nodded slowly and said, "That sounds pleasant." He looked relieved, almost grateful for my cooperation. I watched him pour himself a drink, unaware that every movement he made was writing a new chapter in a story he thought I was too old to narrate. That night, I took the old radio from the cupboard and tuned it to a station that played jazz after midnight. The trumpet's moan filled the room like memory. I sat at the piano again, pressed one note, then another, and listened to the vibrations fade into the air. Music had always been my form of thought. I could measure my clarity in chords. That night the sound was off, hesitant, like my fingers were afraid to remember what freedom felt like. But after a few minutes, something loosened inside me. I played one of my old songs, the one Daniel used to call the ocean piece, because it rose and fell like waves. It sounded different now, slower, heavier, but still mine. Halfway through, I stopped playing and whispered into the empty room, They're selling my house. Saying it aloud made it real. But in that same breath, something inside me whispered back, not yet. The next morning, Carla invited me to drive with her to the grocery store. I went, more out of curiosity than companionship. In the car, she talked about renovations, about how they might open up the living room once the sale goes through, because young families love open plans these days. She said it without shame, without even realizing what she was confessing. I stared out the window, watching the coastline roll past, the gray sea restless under the weight of clouds. It's a lovely house, she said, but it's not really functional for you anymore. It's very functional for me, I said quietly. I function here every day. She laughed softly, thinking I was joking. At the store, while she was comparing prices of imported cheese, I wandered into the small stationery aisle and found myself looking at notebooks. I picked one with a dark green cover, the color of old gardens, and bought it with cash. That evening after dinner, I opened it at the kitchen table and wrote on the first page, "They think they're saving me. They're selling me." It was the first time in years I'd written anything longer than a grocery list. The words steadied me. The act of writing was an anchor, proof that I was still the author of something, even if only of my own record. 2 days later, an appraiser came by while I was home alone. A tall man in a neat jacket with a clipboard and professional smile. "Good morning, ma'am," he said. "I'm here for the property evaluation." My chest tightened, but I forced a polite smile. "Oh," I said, "my son didn't mention you were coming." "They said you'd be expecting me." He looked around, oblivious to the storm gathering behind my calm expression. "Beautiful home," he added. "Hard to find this kind of craftsmanship anymore." I watched him move through my rooms, measuring walls, taking photos, his footsteps echoing over the floors I'd waxed myself for decades. When he left, I followed him out and stood on the porch, watching his car disappear down the street. I felt like someone standing at her own funeral, listening to the eulogies while still breathing. That night, I couldn't eat. The soup tasted like dust. I sat in the dim kitchen, the letter from the assessor and my green notebook side by side on the table. I thought about calling a lawyer, but hesitated. Not yet. First, I needed to understand how far they'd gone. The next morning, I called the bank pretending to inquire about my savings. The young man on the phone was cheerful, unaware of the storm behind my voice. When he mentioned that an authorization for consultation had been requested on my account, I felt the blood rush to my ears. "By whom?" I asked. "It says here, a Mr. Daniel Ross, joint power of attorney." My hand trembled slightly as I thanked him and hung up. Joint power of attorney. I never signed anything. He must have forged it or slipped a document among others I'd signed years ago. I walked to the living room and sat by the piano again. The keys were cool under my fingertips. The betrayal wasn't just financial. It was spiritual, the erasure of my autonomy, wrapped in the language of care. I pressed a single low note and let it linger. The vibration filled the room like a heartbeat, deep and unbroken. I told myself, quietly but with conviction, that no one was going to institutionalize me while I could still play. My life was not a file to be closed. That night, for the first time in months, I slept without dreams. When I woke, I knew what to do. I would not confront him yet. Confrontation would only give them a chance to tighten their grip. I would play the part they expected, the docile old woman, grateful for their management, while I made my own arrangements. I would find a way to reclaim my name before they sold it out from under me. The sea outside my window shimmered under the early light, restless, alive. It seemed to whisper, "Move now." I closed my eyes, felt the salt in the air, and promised the house that before they could sign it away, I would sign my own escape. In the weeks that followed, the betrayal thickened, not through open cruelty, but through what I can only describe as an organized kindness. The sort of politeness that scrapes away your name one gesture at a time. Carla began leaving pamphlets on the counter, glossy ones with pastel colors, and photographs of seniors smiling at invisible companions. She never said a word about them. She just left them near the kettle or tucked under my newspaper, so that every morning began with another reminder that my independence was being marketed back to me. Daniel started dropping by unannounced, pretending to check on the plumbing or help with the mail, but always with the same restless glance around the house, as though he were already calculating how much the furniture might fetch at an estate. Sale. They called it caring. I called it rehearsal. One afternoon, I found Carla in the living room rearranging my photo albums. She said she was just dusting. When I opened the cabinet later, the oldest albums were gone. In their place were a few curated volumes with linen covers and captions she must have written herself. The Ross Family, 2010-2020. My life before that had vanished, reduced to a pile of digital files she stored somewhere in the cloud. I asked where she'd put the old albums. She smiled in that airy way of hers and said, "Oh, don't worry. I scanned everything. It's safer this way. Paper deteriorates." I wanted to tell her that memory doesn't live on hard drives, that the smell of an old photograph is half the reason to keep it, but I didn't. I just nodded and went to my room, feeling the first quiet tremor of disappearance run through me. Around that time, Daniel started talking about decluttering. He called it a gift. "Mom, you don't need all these things. Less stuff, less stress." I taught him to clean his room by turning it into a game when he was small. Now he was turning my history into a landfill. He hired a company that specialized in estate transitions, and a woman with a clipboard came to take inventory. She asked if I wanted to tag the items I wished to keep. "Tag them?" I asked. "Like what? An animal in the wild?" She didn't smile. She said it would help streamline the process. I excused myself, walked into the garden, and stood among the tulips. The air was heavy with the scent of soil and salt. I realized then that the erasure had already begun. I was being managed into nothingness under the banner of efficiency. The first thing they moved was my chair, the old blue armchair by the window, where I read every night. Carla said it was too faded, that it clashed with the new aesthetic. The new chair they brought in was angular and beige, a piece of furniture designed for showrooms, not humans. When I sat in it, it made a small sound like disapproval. I told them I missed the old one, and Carla laughed lightly. "We donated it, Mom. Isn't that nice? Someone else will enjoy it now." I didn't ask who. I knew they hadn't donated it to anyone who would understand that the indent in the cushion was the shape of my entire adult life. After that came the cleaning schedule. Suddenly, I wasn't allowed to wash my own dishes because the detergent is too harsh. Carla hired a cleaner twice a week, a young woman with earbuds and no interest in conversation. She would move quickly through the house, wiping away every trace of my routine, the tea rings on the counter, the folded towels, the faint pencil marks I used to keep track of expenses. By the time she left, the house looked newer, emptier, less like mine. The smell of citrus disinfectant replaced the scent of soap and paper. It was as though someone had pressed reset on the home I had spent 4 decades building. I began to wake earlier before dawn, just to have an hour that still belonged to me. I'd make coffee quietly, careful not to trigger the motion lights Daniel had installed in the hallway for safety. The light would flicker on anyway, flooding the space in a sterile white glow that made everything look temporary. I started keeping my green notebook close, recording small things. The time the first gull cried, the way the sea smelled before rain, the precise shade of the sky when the tide turned. It was a small rebellion, an act of documentation against the slow theft of my context. Then came the passwords. One morning, my email wouldn't open. Daniel had updated my accounts to make things simpler. All my bills, my bank statements, my subscriptions, everything now went through him. It's safer, he said, less for you to worry about. I thanked him because arguing would only prove his point. Later that night, I opened the drawer where I kept my husband's old fountain pen and wrote on the inside of the notebook cover, "They call it safety when they mean control." By early May, the real estate agent began visiting regularly. A cheerful woman with bright lipstick and the kind of optimism that could level cities. "This place will go fast," she told me. "The coastal market is booming." She asked if I'd be comfortable with a few minor renovations before listing. Daniel explained that they planned to stage the house for viewings. The word staging made me think of funerals, of bodies dressed up for display. They discussed paint colors, lighting, open houses, while I sat at the end of the table drinking tea that had gone cold. They never once asked if I wanted to sell. They spoke as if it were already done. After the agent left, I walked to the piano and played a single chord. The sound was full and low, vibrating through the floorboards. I remembered something my husband used to say when the world disappointed him. "You can't reason with people who've forgotten how to blush." Daniel had stopped blushing years ago. I thought of calling him back into the room, forcing him to sit and listen to what he was doing, but I didn't. Instead, I played another chord, softer this time, and let the echo fade until the only sound left was the sea beyond the window. One morning, I caught Carla photographing the garden. She said she wanted before pictures for the listing. The sight of her phone aimed at my flowers was the final straw. I told her to stop. She smiled that professional smile of hers and said, "Mom, it's for the brochure. You'll want people to see how beautiful your home is." "My home," I repeated. The words tasted strange, almost forgotten. She blinked, realizing her mistake. "Of course," she said quickly. "I just mean our family's home." I turned away, unwilling to give her the satisfaction of seeing my face. That night, I dreamt I was packing boxes that had no bottoms. Everything I placed inside fell through, clattering onto a floor that wasn't there. I woke up sweating, the taste of dust in my mouth. It was still dark. I went to the window, opened it wide, and let the cold sea air hit my face. The sky was a dull gray, heavy with fog. I whispered into the mist, "Not yet. You don't get to erase me yet." The next day, I made my first quiet act of resistance. While Carla was out and Daniel at work, I called a locksmith. The man was old, kind-eyed, smelled faintly of tobacco. I told him one of the doors had been sticking and that I needed a new key cut. He fixed it quickly, then asked if I wanted an extra copy. I did. That copy went straight into my purse, wrapped in a handkerchief. When Daniel later replaced the main locks for security, I smiled inwardly, knowing he hadn't found mine. It was a small thing, almost nothing, but it gave me the strange calm of a person with a secret. Still, the days blurred. The house, once my anchor, began to feel like a hotel lobby where everyone else had checked out. Even the lights seemed different, colder, filtered through decisions I hadn't made. I started walking farther each morning, down to the docks, where fishermen mended their nets and old women sold bread from baskets. One of them, a wiry lady with hands like driftwood, called out to me one day. "You're the woman from the yellow house," she said. I used to see your husband buy coffee at the pier. I nodded. He loved it here. She smiled, showing gaps where teeth used to be. Then don't let them take it from you. It was the first time in weeks that someone spoke to me like I still had agency. I went home lighter, almost smiling, but the pressure continued. The next week, Daniel brought home a glossy binder labeled Transition Plan. Inside were printed schedules, checklists, even sample menus from nursing homes. We just want to be organized, he said, sliding it across the table. I flipped through it slowly. The first page was titled, Phase 1, Property Liquidation. The last page read, Resident Orientation. The word resident made my stomach tighten. It sounded like a euphemism for disappearance. I closed the binder, smiled, and said, You've thought of everything. He looked pleased, unaware that the moment he handed me that binder, he'd given me the timeline of my escape. That night, I packed a small suitcase, not to run yet, but to remind myself that I still could. Inside, I placed my passport, a few clothes, the green notebook, and the photograph of my husband in his old Navy uniform. I set it beside the bed and felt, for the first time in months, like I could breathe. When the wind howled against the window, the house creaked in sympathy, and I whispered, Hold on a little longer. We're not finished. The next morning, when Carla arrived with another list of nursing homes, I greeted her with tea and asked if she'd like sugar. She said no, she was cutting back. I smiled, thinking how fitting it was. Cutting back, trimming away, reducing everything to convenience. As she talked about long-term comfort, I looked at her face and saw not malice, but fear. The fear of growing old, of becoming me. For a brief, strange moment, I almost pitied her. Then I remembered the letter from the assessor and the appraiser's footsteps echoing through my living room, and the pity evaporated. By late afternoon, I had decided I would not wait for them to ship me off like old furniture. The world still had corners where a woman like me could breathe. All I needed was time, and I had already stolen a little of it back. As evening fell, I lit a candle on the piano, opened the window, and began to play the ocean piece again, this time louder. The notes rose and fell like the tide, filling the house with something alive. Outside, the gulls cried, and the smell of salt drifted in. I thought, if anyone passing by heard the music, they would think an old woman was simply playing to fill the silence. But I knew the truth. I was signaling to myself that the erasure had reached its limit. The next act would be mine. The turning point came quietly, without thunder or confrontation, the way most real changes arrive in old age, through something small enough to overlook. It was a letter, though not one from my son or the bank, but from an old colleague named Miriam, who had moved to southern Portugal years ago after her husband died. We hadn't written to each other in more than a decade. Her handwriting was as careful as ever, narrow loops and slanted lines, as if she were still grading papers. She told me she had bought a small villa outside Faro, that the winters were mild, the bread excellent, and the neighbors kind. You should come, she wrote. There's room here for women like us, the kind who have lived too long inside other people's plans. I read the sentence 3 times. There was something in those words, a kind of daring so gentle it almost felt like permission. The idea stayed with me long after I folded the letter and placed it beside my green notebook. That night, lying awake, I imagined what it would feel like to live in a place that asked nothing of me except to exist. No duty, no management, no being useful in exchange for space. Just the sound of my own footsteps and the sea. The next morning, I went to the bank. I told Carla I needed to buy birthday cards and walked to the branch downtown, the one where the tellers still recognized me. I asked to check on an old savings account I hadn't touched since before Daniel married. The young man at the counter pulled it up and smiled politely, telling me the balance and the accumulated interest. The number wasn't enormous, but it was more than enough for a beginning. My husband and I had opened that account the year we bought the house. We called it the Freedom Fund. I never closed it, never withdrew from it, and somehow, through the slow arithmetic of decades, it had survived. When I walked out of the bank, the wind off the ocean smelled different, less like salt, more like possibility. I stood on the corner holding the statement in my hand and realized that I was, in fact, still solvent, still capable of movement. That realization was worth more than the money itself. At home, Carla was on the phone when I came in, her voice bright and falsely casual. She was speaking to someone from care facilities, arranging a tour. I set the groceries down and listened for a moment. "Yes," she said. "She's still fairly mobile, but it's time to start thinking ahead." I went upstairs quietly, sat at my desk, and opened the drawer where I kept Miriam's letter. I reread it, tracing each word with my fingertip. Then I opened my notebook and wrote beneath it, "What if I left first?" The question startled me. For weeks I had been reacting, defending, absorbing. Now, suddenly, I was imagining offense, strategy, creation. I folded the page carefully, as if the ink itself could betray me. Over the next few days, the idea grew roots. I started researching travel logistics, first out of curiosity, then with intent. I learned that the direct flights from Boston to Lisbon were still reasonably priced, and that there were small properties along the Algarve coast within my reach. At night, when Daniel and Carla thought I was reading or dozing in front of the television, I sat in the glow of my old laptop, searching listings. Whitewashed walls, tiled terraces, lemon trees, sea views. Each photograph felt like a doorway. I didn't yet know which one I would walk through, but I knew I would. I began to take small steps, subtle enough not to draw attention. I started sorting through my belongings under the guise of decluttering, though I was really packing memories. I gave away things I didn't need, but kept what mattered. The piano sheet music, my husband's letters, the photograph of Daniel as a boy holding a seashell up to his ear, believing it was whispering secrets from the ocean. One evening, I found an envelope in the attic marked mortgage documents. Inside were copies of every payment receipt, every letter from the bank, every scrap of evidence that the house was once fully mine. I placed them in my suitcase, next to my passport and Miriam's letter. Meanwhile, Daniel grew busier with his plans. He and Carla started meeting with lawyers. They spoke in coded phrases around me: the transfer, the closing, the care plan. Their secrecy made them careless. One night, I overheard them in the kitchen. Carla said, "She'll sign anything if you put it in front of her. She trusts you." Daniel replied, "Of course she does. She's Mom." The words settled in me like ice. I realized that trust, the thing I had always believed was sacred between us, had become their chosen weapon. That night, I decided to stop being trustworthy. The next morning, I called a lawyer of my own. I found her number in a local paper, someone specializing in estate disputes. Her name was Amelia, and her voice on the phone was brisk but kind. When I explained what had happened, she was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Mrs. Ross, do you have copies of your documents?" "Everyone," I said. "Then you have power. They can't sell without your consent, not legally." She offered to meet, but I told her not yet. I wanted to keep things quiet a little longer. Before we hung up, She said something I haven't forgotten. Don't let them make you a ghost in your own life. Once you disappear on paper, it's hard to come back. That afternoon, I walked down to the shore, the wind pulling at my coat. The sea was restless, whitecaps breaking and vanishing as quickly as they formed. I thought about ghosts, the kind who haunt and the kind who fade willingly. I decided I would not be either. I would leave openly on my own terms, while still flesh and bone and will. I would not vanish. I would depart. Over the following weeks, I began practicing departure. Not literally at first, but in gestures. I stopped explaining myself. When Daniel asked why I needed cash, I said, for coffee. When Carla wanted to know why I'd been walking to the pier every morning, I said, because the sea still recognizes me. They smiled indulgently, thinking I was simply drifting into sentimentality, the first stage of decline. Their mistake became my camouflage. The more quietly poetic I sounded, the less seriously they took me. It was almost funny, watching them translate my lucidity into senility. One morning, the mail brought another letter from Miriam, this time with photographs. The villa was small but sunlit, white walls covered in vines, a terrace overlooking a garden of rosemary and figs. In the photo, she stood barefoot beside a wrought iron gate, waving at whoever took the picture. On the back, she'd written, "There's a guest house next door for sale. Imagine us, two old teachers, correcting each other's grammar in paradise." I smiled so hard my face hurt. Later that day, I used the public computer at the library to check property listings in that very village. One in particular caught my eye. A single-story stone house with blue shutters and a view of the Atlantic. The price was less than what Daniel's agent said the house here would sell for. I printed the listing and folded it into my notebook. The next time I saw Daniel, he told me he'd scheduled a facility visit for the following week. Just to look around, he said. No pressure. I agreed immediately. His relief was almost touching. That night, while he slept under my roof for what would be one of the last times, I wrote in my notebook, "If they believe I'm compliant, I'm free." As days passed, a quiet clarity settled over me. I started noticing things I had stopped seeing, the way the horizon darkened before rain, the flicker of my own reflection in the piano lid, the pulse in my wrists when I turned the key in the lock. The house no longer felt like a prison, but like a stage set waiting for its curtain to fall. I thought often of my husband. He used to say, "You can start over at any age, but the older you are, the fewer people will clap." I didn't want applause. I wanted air. The morning I finally called the airline, the sky outside was clear and pale, a forgiving kind of blue. The woman on the phone asked for my travel dates. I told her I wasn't sure yet, but soon. She laughed and said, "We have good fares for those who are sure of their hearts." I booked a one-way ticket to Lisbon 3 weeks out. I hung up the phone, wrote the date on a slip of paper, and slid it inside my husband's old pocket watch. I knew then that whatever happened, I had already crossed the midpoint. The rest would be motion. That evening, as I walked by the water, a gust of wind scattered gulls into the air, white flashes against the darkening sky. I felt their lift in my own chest. I thought of Daniel and Carla, of their well-intentioned cruelty, their fear disguised as order. I wasn't angry anymore, only certain. People like them confuse safety with control, but I had lived long enough to know the difference. The sea was roaring, and for the first time in years, I heard in it not loneliness, but invitation. The day they decided to bring the placement specialist was the day I realized they no longer saw me as a mother or even as a woman, but as an obstacle wrapped in skin, something to be negotiated around. They called it an assessment visit, A formality, nothing to worry about, as Daniel said, his voice carefully level, the way people speak to patients who have not yet been told their diagnosis. Carla arranged everything, tea, biscuits, a clean tablecloth, like she was hosting a small celebration. The specialist arrived at 10 sharp, a woman in her 50s with neat hair and eyes that registered everything but understood nothing. She introduced herself as Margaret, said she was there to discuss options for continuing care. Her voice had the texture of bureaucracy, smooth, practiced, without emotional residue. She asked if I'd had any recent falls, if I took my medication regularly, if I ever felt confused or anxious. I answered calmly, my diction crisp, each syllable a blade. She noted my responses, smiling politely, mistaking composure for compliance. Daniel sat beside her, nodding along as if rehearsing what empathy looked like. I watched him through the thin veil of steam rising from my cup, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see my son. I saw a man so afraid of mortality that he would rather exile it than face it. Margaret handed me a folder with color photographs of smiling residents playing cards, baking muffins, stretching their arms toward the sun. These are wonderful communities, she said. You'd have companionship, structure, and full medical support. I flipped through the images, each one more sterile than the last, every smile identical, rehearsed. I wanted to ask if they also photographed the residents at night, when they lay in narrow beds, listening to their own memories fade. Instead, I asked how often residents were allowed to leave the premises. She hesitated, then said, "Oh, they're quite free to move around, but we do have safety protocols." Safety, always safety, the word that has become a synonym for permission denied. I thanked her and closed the folder. When she left, Daniel kissed my cheek and said, "It's just a first step." I smiled. "Yes," I said, "the first." He didn't understand what kind of step I meant. That evening, when the house was quiet, I took out the ticket confirmation I had printed at the library. One way to Lisbon, departure date now less than 2 weeks away. I felt the edges of the paper against my fingers and thought about the weight of freedom, how it's both featherlight and impossible to carry. I hid the ticket between the pages of an old cookbook, one Carla never opened because it didn't match her modern tastes. I poured myself a small glass of sherry and drank it slowly, watching the reflection of the candle flame tremble on the table. It was strange to feel both terrified and alive in equal measure. Over the next few days, Carla's tone changed. She began speaking to me as if I were already half gone, referring to my belongings in the past tense. "We'll need to decide what to do with your things," she said one morning while sorting through the linen closet. "Most of it we can donate." I told her I wanted to handle it myself, but she waved me off. "You don't need to stress. We'll take care of everything." The phrase, "we'll take care of everything," has always been the polite form of conquest. They were already dividing me up, room by room, memory by memory. The house itself seemed to react to this intrusion. The walls held sound differently. Footsteps echoed where they hadn't before. Even the sea sounded distant. I started to feel like a ghost haunting my own life. I began to imagine what would happen after I left, not to them, but to the house. Would it remember me? Would it sigh in the evenings when no one was listening, missing the rhythm of my footsteps, the way I hummed while watering the tulips? I found myself whispering to it sometimes, promising that I wasn't abandoning it, that I was saving it from being turned into an investment portfolio. One night, Daniel came to my room holding a folder. "Mom," he said, "I need you to sign a few papers, just for the power of attorney, to make transactions smoother when you move. His tone was kind, almost tender, but there was a strain behind it. I took the folder and looked at the papers slowly, pretending to read line by line while my heart raced. I recognized enough legal language to know that one of the documents transferred temporary ownership rights. "I'll sign them tomorrow," I said, handing the folder back. "I want to read them carefully." He hesitated, his jaw tightening just slightly, then nodded. "Of course. Take your time." When he left, I locked my bedroom door, spread the papers on the bed, and photographed every page with my phone. Then I slipped them back into the folder and placed it outside my door, exactly where he'd left it. In the morning, I told him I couldn't find my glasses and would sign later. By evening, the papers were gone. He never mentioned them again, perhaps assuming he'd find another way. I deleted the photos from my phone and stored them on a flash drive hidden in my shoe. I didn't know if I'd ever need them, but instinct told me to keep them. A few days later, Carla told me she'd booked a tour at a facility called Silver Dunes. "You'll love it," she said. "It's by the ocean." The irony made me laugh before I could stop myself. "I already live by the ocean," I said. She blinked, confused by the statement, as though geography were irrelevant. They'd chosen Saturday for the visit. Conveniently, Saturday was the same day I'd arranged to meet Amelia, the lawyer, in town. I told them I'd come to the tour. Of course I would. And then I called Amelia to confirm our appointment. She said she'd prepare the documents I'd need to revoke any unauthorized power of attorney and to safeguard my remaining accounts. "You can still act independently, Mrs. Ross," she said. "You just have to do it before they make another move." I told her I understood. That Friday night, I barely slept. I lay awake, listening to the house breathe, every creak of the floorboard sounding like a clock counting down. Around 3 a.m, I got up and began to pack for real. Not the pretend packing I'd done weeks before, but the deliberate, irreversible kind. I folded each piece of clothing with care, rolling them tightly to fit more into the suitcase. I took the essentials, a few dresses, my husband's letters, the photo albums Carla hadn't digitized, the piano sheet music, the green notebook. From the dresser, I took my jewelry box, not for its contents, most of it is worthless, but for the sound it makes when it closes, a small satisfying click that reminds me of finality. When I finished, I looked around the room. Everything I left behind, books, teacups, furniture, felt suddenly lighter, as though they too were ready to be free of all this. Morning came gray and windless. Daniel and Carla arrived early, cheerful and efficient, ready for the outing. "Just think of this as an adventure," Carla said. I smiled. "I'll do my best." They drove us to Silver Dunes, a sprawling white complex perched on a cliff. From the outside, it looked like a seaside resort. Inside, it smelled faintly of disinfectant and resignation. The receptionist handed me a brochure printed on thick paper. Words like vibrant, community, and wellness screamed from every page. A nurse led us down a hallway, lined with framed photographs of the ocean, always the same wave, frozen in different shades of blue. Residents sat in a lounge watching television, their faces uniformly blank. I tried to imagine myself there and couldn't. The absence of noise, of true life, was suffocating. I turned to Daniel and said, "It's very clean." He smiled, thinking it was approval. When the tour ended, Carla was radiant, convinced she had found the perfect solution. "They even have piano nights," she said, as if that would sweeten the poison. Daniel nodded. "See, Mom? You'd still get to play." I looked at him for a long moment and said, "Yes, I suppose I would." That was the first time I noticed how much he resembled his father, not in kindness, but in the way he refused to hear what didn't fit his plans. On the drive home, I stared out the window at the sea. The horizon was pale and endless, the color of something beginning rather than ending. I decided that when I saw it again, it would be from the other side of the world. That evening, while they talked about paperwork in the kitchen, I slipped upstairs and called Amelia from the bedroom. "I'm ready," I said. "I want to transfer the funds to a private account." She said it could be done immediately. "And you're certain?" she asked. "Completely." I gave her the instructions, and within minutes, the account that Daniel believed he controlled no longer existed. The money had moved, quietly, legally, irrevocably. I thanked her, hung up, and sat on the bed. For the first time in months, I exhaled without fear. I felt my pulse in my wrists, steady and deliberate. I realized I had just committed the most subversive act of my life. I had taken back ownership of myself. The next day, Daniel suggested another family meeting. "We just want to finalize plans," he said. I agreed, though my mind was already elsewhere. While they sat discussing logistics, I watched their faces, the faint sheen of sweat on Daniel's forehead, the way Carla kept glancing at him for approval. They had built an entire scaffolding of certainty around themselves, never imagining that I might have built one too. When they were done, I thanked them both for all their care and told them I wanted to have a quiet weekend to think. They looked pleased, confident I was yielding. When they left, I locked the door and took out my notebook. I wrote one sentence. "Tomorrow, I stop pretending." That night, the wind rose, rattling the shutters. I played the piano until my hands ached, until the sound filled every corner of the house, the same house they planned to sell out from under me. The melody turned fierce, almost wild. At one point, I laughed aloud because I realized I was no longer afraid. Not of them, not of loneliness, not of age. Fear, after all, is only useful to those who wish to cage you. I stopped playing, sat in the silence that followed, and felt the exact moment when my life tilted toward freedom. 2 days later, on a Monday morning heavy with fog, I packed the last of my things and placed the suitcase by the door. My flight was in 3 days, but I wanted to be ready. When Daniel called to check on me, I answered sweetly, told him I was resting and thinking about the Silver Dunes offer. "Take your time," he said. "No rush." I smiled into the phone. "Thank you, darling. I'll let you know soon." After hanging up, I stood in front of the mirror, studied my reflection, and whispered, "Soon means never." The final days passed in a strange calm. I went for walks, visited the pier, spoke with the fishermen, and even bought a small silver pendant from the woman who sold seashells. I told her I was leaving. She nodded solemnly and said, "Then take a piece of this place with you." I slipped the pendant into my pocket. At home, I made tea and sat by the window. The tulips were fading, their petals curling inward like tired hands. I thought of all the times I'd tried to explain love to my students, how I told them it was a form of attention, a sustained act of seeing. My son had stopped seeing me long ago, but I still saw myself. That, I decided, was enough to begin again. When the morning of my flight finally came, I left a letter on the kitchen table addressed to Daniel and Carla. I didn't write apologies or accusations, only a single paragraph. "You thought safety meant control. I have chosen another kind of safety, the one that comes from being free. Do not look for me. I am not lost." Then I closed the door behind me, locked it, and slipped the key into the mailbox slot. The sound it made as it fell was small but absolute, the sound of an ending. I walked to the taxi, waiting at the curb, the sea still hidden by fog, but I could smell it in the air, that sharp, unignorable scent of salt and distance. When the car pulled away, I didn't look back. The horizon ahead was pale, widening, full of promise. They didn't expect me to return for Sunday brunch. Perhaps they thought I would stay silent in that gray house forever, nodding politely as they dismantled me, one polite meeting at a time. But I had promised myself that when I spoke next, it would be for the last time, and that my words would not tremble. I dressed carefully that morning in a long linen dress the color of sand, the same one I'd worn to Daniel's wedding. The fabric was soft against my skin, smelling faintly of lavender. I pinned my hair back, fastened my small pearl earrings, and looked at myself in the mirror. The face that looked back was older, yes, but clear, not fragile, not broken, clear. I slipped Miriam's letter into my purse, along with a copy of the transfer receipt from the bank and the printout of my villa's purchase agreement, each page folded precisely, a small arsenal of truth. When I arrived, Carla opened the door, surprised but smiling too widely. "You look lovely," she said, as if she were addressing a guest of honor at a wake. Daniel appeared behind her, holding a glass of orange juice. "Mom, we didn't think you'd make it," he said. "You should have called." "I wanted to surprise you," I said, stepping past them into the dining room. The table was set beautifully, fresh flowers, white plates, the silverware polished. They had prepared the illusion of family harmony one more time. "How nice," I said, touching the tablecloth. "It's been a while since we've all sat down together." We ate quietly at first. Carla spoke about her work, Daniel about some new project, both of them performing normalcy. I listened, nodding, letting the rhythm of their voices circle the room like wind trapped in a jar. I thought about how many meals I had cooked for this son, how many times I had watched him eat without gratitude, thinking only of his next appointment, his next ambition. I had fed his body and his confidence until both were too large to fit inside this house. When he finally asked, "How have you been, Mom?" I smiled. "Peaceful," I said. "Very peaceful lately." He seemed pleased by that, unaware that peace can be the stillness before a storm. After the plates were cleared, I reached into my purse and took out the folded papers. I placed them carefully in the center of the table, smoothing them flat with my palm. "I have some news," I said. "Something I've decided." Carla looked curious, Daniel wary. "About Silver Dunes?" he asked. "No," I said, "about my future." I paused for a moment, enjoying the quiet. "I'm buying a villa," I said finally, "in Portugal. The transfer went through last week." The sentence hung in the air like a bird refusing to land. For a moment, they both just stared. Then Daniel laughed, short and confused. "Mom, what are you talking about?" "Exactly what I said," I replied, sliding the papers toward him. "A villa on the southern coast, with a garden and a view of the sea. I leave this week." He looked at the documents, at the bank letterhead, the legal stamps, the signature unmistakably mine. His laughter died in his throat. Carla reached across the table and picked up the paper with trembling fingers. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice low. We thought." "I know what you thought," I interrupted gently. "That's why I didn't tell you. You've made so many plans for me. I decided to make one of my own." Daniel's face turned red. Mom, you can't just run off like that. Do you have any idea what you're doing?" "More than you think," I said. "I know the cost of living there. I've spoken with a lawyer. I've handled the finances myself. I'm not running, Daniel. I'm moving forward." His mouth opened, closed, opened again. "This is crazy," he said finally. "You're being impulsive." You're not well. Stop, I said quietly, but the word landed like a stone. Don't use my age as an insult. You've been planning my disappearance for months, and you call me impulsive for planning my freedom. Carla tried to intervene, her tone soft, placating. Eleanor, please, think about this rationally. What if something happens to you there? You'll be alone. I smiled. I've been alone for years, dear. I was just polite enough not to mention it. Her mouth tightened. Daniel stood up, pacing. You can't make these kinds of decisions without consulting us. Consulting you? I repeated, almost laughing. When did that become the law of my life? When did I sign away the right to my own choices? Oh, wait, I added. Perhaps you can tell me, since you seem to have a talent for forging my signature. His face drained of color. What are you implying? I'm not implying anything, I said. I'm stating facts. The bank, the assessor, the inquiries, the documents, you made them all in my name. But you see, my name still belongs to me. There was a long silence, the kind that fills rooms just before something irreversible happens. Daniel sat down slowly, his voice now pleading. Mom, we were trying to protect you. No, I said. You were trying to protect your idea of me, the frail old woman who should be grateful for your management. But that woman doesn't exist. I took a breath, feeling something inside me settle, like a tide reaching its final line on the sand. I know what you've done, Daniel, and I forgive you because I understand fear, but I won't live inside it. Not yours, not mine. He pressed his palms against the table, shaking his head. You can't just disappear. We're your family. Exactly, I said. You're my family, not my keepers. Carla looked as if she might cry, though whether from shame or outrage, I couldn't tell. I reached for her hand, gently but firmly. You've both forgotten something important, I said. I was a person before I was a mother. I had a name before you learned to say it, and I refused to let that name become a line item in your spreadsheet. They didn't speak. The only sound was the faint tick of the clock above the doorway, a small mechanical reminder that time belongs to no one. I stood up, gathering my purse. I won't stay for dessert, I said softly. I have a train to catch. Daniel's voice cracked. Where are you even going? To the airport, I said, then to Lisbon, then to my own front door. He reached out as if to stop me, but his hand froze halfway. I think he finally understood that there was nothing left to grasp. At the doorway, I turned back. I left the house papers in the drawer by the piano, I said. You can sell it if you like. I've already transferred the proceeds I'm entitled to. Consider the rest my gift to you. I hope you use it to build something real, something you won't have to steal. His eyes glistened, and for a moment I saw the boy he once was, standing in the doorway of his childhood room, frightened by thunder. I almost reached out to touch his face, but then I remembered the letter, the signatures, the quiet betrayals spoken in practical tones, and I let the moment pass. As I stepped outside, the air smelled of rain. The sky had that heavy, metallic hue that precedes a storm, though the sea beyond was still calm. I walked slowly to the gate, each step deliberate, steady. Behind me, I heard the door open and Carla's voice calling my name, but I didn't turn. I had nothing left to say. The taxi was waiting at the curb, its engine idling softly. The driver helped me with my suitcase, unaware that it carried not just clothes, but the remnants of an entire life, folded between fabric and paper. As we drove away, I looked back once, not at them, but at the house. The curtains fluttered slightly, as if the walls themselves were exhaling relief. I thought about how strange it was that endings can look so much like beginnings when seen from the right distance. My hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the enormity of motion after so much stillness. The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "Going far, ma'am?" he asked. "Far enough," I said, watching the coastline blur into the horizon. When the plane lifted off the runway later that evening, I felt the pressure in my ears, the small ache of altitude. I closed my eyes, let it pass, and when I opened them, the clouds were below us, stretched like a soft, endless field. Somewhere beneath that white expanse was everything I was leaving behind. Names, rooms, disappointments, the long echo of silence. I took Miriam's letter from my bag, unfolded it one last time, and read her final line. There's a kind of freedom that waits only for those who dare to act when everyone expects surrender. I smiled. Below, the Atlantic shimmered like a mirror, reflecting nothing but sky. The villa was smaller than I had imagined, but when I unlocked the blue-painted door for the first time, the air inside smelled of salt and sun and rosemary, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a sense of arrival. The rooms were cool and simple, whitewashed walls, terracotta tiles that kept the heat beneath my bare feet, and windows that opened to an ocean so bright it looked like liquid glass. Outside, the wind carried the sound of gulls and church bells, and in that blend of noise and stillness, I realized that I was hearing the first true silence of my life. I stood in the center of the room, my suitcase unopened, and laughed softly to myself. The laughter startled me. It had texture. It came from the chest, not the throat. It didn't sound like defiance or relief. It sounded like life asserting itself after a long absence. In the days that followed, I adjusted to the rhythm of this new place. Mornings began early, with the light crawling across the floor, and the smell of coffee drifting in from the neighbor's courtyard. There was a fig tree just beyond my terrace, its branches heavy with fruit, and I learned how to pluck them gently so the skin didn't tear. The woman who sold bread at the corner greeted me every morning with "Bom dia, Señora Corajosa," the brave lady. I never told her the story of why I came. I didn't need to. In small towns, people recognize the difference between running away and walking towards something. The body speaks its own language. Mine had stopped flinching. Sometimes I would sit by the window and write in my notebook, the same green one that had followed me across an ocean. The pages were almost full now, dates, details, fragments of thought, things I wanted to remember before they faded into the endless continuity of peace. I wrote about the scent of the sea at dusk, the sound of children chasing a ball in the street, the way old women in this town wore perfume like a form of resistance. I also wrote about Daniel and Carla, though not as villains anymore. I wrote them as what they truly were. Frightened, well-intentioned heirs of a world that worships control. They weren't cruel because they wanted to be. They were cruel because they thought safety was love. I forgave them quietly one afternoon while shelling almonds by the window. Forgiveness is not a door you open for the other person. It's the act of removing their shadow from your own room. When I set down the last shell, the light shifted across the floor, and I felt unburdened. Letters arrived from them eventually. The first was practical, a list of questions. Was I healthy? Did I need money? Had I reconsidered? I replied with a single postcard showing the view from my terrace. On the back, I wrote, "I am well. The sea is loud and kind." A month later came another letter, this one shorter, more tentative. Daniel wrote, "You shocked us, Mom. I didn't understand. Maybe I still don't. But I hope you're happy." I read it twice, folded it neatly, and tucked it into the same drawer as Miriam's letter. There was a small ache when I read his handwriting, the ache of knowing that love, like any living thing, changes form when left unattended. But I no longer wanted to fix it. Some distances are meant to stay wide, not as punishment, but as space to breathe. The piano was gone, of course, left behind with the ghosts of that house, but sometimes I would hum while sweeping or cooking, and the melody of the ocean piece returned in fragments. The sound came softer now, like a memory rewritten in another key. One afternoon, a neighbor brought me an old upright piano from a relative's house. It was out of tune, chipped, and perfect. I spent days polishing the wood, touching the keys until they stopped feeling foreign. When I finally played again, the notes filled the villa and spilled out into the courtyard, where a few children gathered to listen. Their faces were curious, expectant, unclouded by pity. When I finished, one of them clapped and said, "It sounds like the sea." I nodded. "It is," I said. "The nights here are softer than anywhere I've lived." I sit on the terrace with a glass of wine, the wind wrapping around me like an old friend, the stars arranged in the quiet pattern of things that have always been and will always be. Sometimes I imagine Daniel sitting at his kitchen table, maybe with a glass of whiskey, wondering what his mother is doing at that very moment. I hope he imagines me exactly as I am, alive, unafraid, content. I hope Carla, wherever she is, learns one day that control is the enemy of love, and I hope that when they grow old, they remember that I was the first to refuse the comfortable cage. A few weeks ago, a young woman from the village came to interview me for a local paper. She said she was writing a piece about women who begin again after 70. I laughed and told her I hadn't begun again. I had simply stopped ending. She smiled, wrote it down, and asked if she could take a photograph. I said yes, on one condition, that she capture the sea behind me. When the picture appeared in the paper, I was sitting at my terrace table, hair loose, eyes steady. Beneath the photo, the caption read, "She bought a villa when everyone expected her to retire." I cut it out and taped it to the wall by the piano. Every time I pass it, I touch the edge lightly, not out of vanity, but out of gratitude, for the proof that courage can arrive long after youth is gone. Sometimes, at dawn, I walk down to the water. The sand is cool and damp, the waves licking at my ankles. I think about my mother, about the nights I sat beside her bed, holding her hand as she slipped in and out of sleep. I remember promising her that I would not let life make me small. It took me decades to keep that promise, but I did. The tide pulls against my feet, and I whisper into the wind, "I made it, Mama. I didn't disappear." The sea roars in response, not in words, but in the ancient language of persistence. I have learned that freedom isn't a grand gesture. It's a sequence of quiet decisions, each one reclaiming an inch of your own life. Mine began with a single refusal. I will not be managed. It grew into motion, into distance, into a home that smells of salt and light. I do not know how many years I have left, but for the first time in my life, I don't measure them by what's slipping away. I measure them by the mornings I wake up and realize that I am still miraculously mine.